Hello friends. Happy Mother's Day to you if you are a mother. If you have a mother who is living, I want to just remind you that you need to call your mother or go see your mother today and tell her that you love her. If your mother is deceased, if your mother's gone on to glory, today's a good day to thank God for all the blessings that woman brought into your life. And I also want to note that Mother's Day is not a happy occasion for all of us, that for whatever reason some of us have had lives in which there was trouble and disappointment in our mother-child relationships. I want you to know that I understand that, and I'm sorry that that's the case for you this day. I'd also like to share a little bit about my mother's sort of unique story growing up. My mother, whose name is Judy, was born in 1926, and she was the first of 10 children in her family. She and all her brothers and sisters were born right before or born in or at least grew up during the Great Depression. Her family lived in Rochester, New York. They were tenant farmers. She had an aunt and uncle, Judy did, who lived in West Milton, Pennsylvania. And one summer when she was a toddler, because she was the oldest, she spent several weeks with her aunt and uncle in Pennsylvania. And she had such a good time, and they had such a good time caring for her, that the following summer they invited her to come back and spend the whole summer with them, which she did. She had such a good time that summer that the following summer the same thing happened. And somehow, some way in that next summer, the decision was made, since Judy would be going to first grade in the fall, that it would be a good idea for her to stay with that aunt and uncle, and she could go to first grade in West Milton, Pennsylvania. And there began what was an informal adoption of my mother, Judy, by her Aunt Claire and Uncle Norman. And in many ways, that informal adoption that continued through the time she was an adult, that informal adoption was a great blessing for her. In Uncle Norman's house, Uncle Norman had a steady job as a conductor on the railroad, even in the Depression's lean years. She was the only child, so there were plenty of resources. And of course, she was abundantly loved by her aunt and uncle. So it was a real blessing for her. But you know what? It was also difficult for her. It was painful in a way, because as she grew, she struggled with this question: why was I the one they gave away? All of her brothers and sisters had stayed with their natural mother and father, but not her. All of the rest of them grew up together near Rochester, New York, but not her. And she couldn't help but think, is it because they didn't love me as much? And that was hurtful to her for a long time. It caused her pain. And you know what? That hurt in her life had an impact on my life, because I'm not exactly sure how she communicated this to me, but I never for a minute in my whole life doubted that my mother loved me unconditionally. She was absolutely committed to expressing that love into my life. And that does not mean that she was a helicopter parent, as they say, who was involved in everything that went on and always advocating for my cause. And it doesn't mean that she was perfect. Certainly she had her quirks, although when I was a kid growing up, who even knows which things are quirks and which ones aren't. And she certainly was not always happy with the way I behaved. But through all those things, my mother always sent the clear and undoubted message that I was loved unconditionally. And so my mother and I had a love connection. She was there on the day I was born, and I was there with her on the day that she died. So all of our shared life, she and I had a love connection. I want to talk with you today about living the resurrection life, meaning what kind of a life is it we're called to live in this post-resurrection time, having seen what happened with God in Jesus Christ and how Jesus was raised from the dead and offers to us this special resurrection life. What does that mean? And today I want to talk with you about how love and connection are part of that life. We just banter that word, love, around an awfully lot. It has many definitions. It's always a popular theme of songs and movies and theater and books and stories. Jesus talked about it a lot as well. In Matthew 22, someone asked him, "What was the greatest commandment?" And Jesus said, "The greatest commandment is this, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength." And he went on to say, "And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself." And he even went so far as to say, everything hangs on these two things. So he was saying, this love thing, it is the most critical thing that you need to know. Now, a little later in his life, Jesus told his disciples what he expected of them as he was leaving earth to return to heaven. And here's what he said, and we call this the Great Commission. He said, "I want you to go out to the ends of the earth, and I want you to teach them what I taught you, so that redemption can come that the power of God can come to every corner of creation." So if we were going to boil down what Jesus calls us to, and it's important that we have some focus because there's a lot of detail in the Bible. It's a big book with a lot of information. But if we were going to boil down what Jesus called us to into one statement, I believe this would be it. Love God, love each other, love the world. So now that we understand how important Jesus thinks love is, I want to just read for you from the Gospel according to John, chapter 15, beginning in the 9th verse. Listen to what Jesus has to say about love, because he sort of puts a point on it. He defines for us what it is he means by love. Listen to what he says. "As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Now remain in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. My command is this, love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this." Listen. "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends, for everything that I learned from my Father I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you so that you might go and bear fruit that will last, and so that whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give you. This is my command, love each other." May God add his blessing to the reading of his holy word. So you notice there in that text, I hope, that Jesus finishes up with his command to love each other. And that earlier in the text, he said love means this. a willingness to sacrifice ourselves even unto death if necessary for the sake of the other. That is to be turned completely outward in our approach to life. Just a couple of days ago, I saw a story on the news of a car accident on a bridge near Ocean City, Maryland, in which a baby in a car seat had fallen out of a car over the side of a bridge into the bay, dropped about 30 feet from the bridge top down under the water. And another person involved in that accident was looking over the rail over the side of the bridge and saw this happen, looked down there and saw that little girl laying in the water next to her car seat. And he stepped over the bridge railing, jumped down into the water, rescued that little girl, and they were able to pick them up on a boat that was passing nearby. I saw a news conference with that fella and his family a little bit later, and the wife of the fellow who did the jumping said, you know, it's pretty remarkable that he did that because he's afraid of heights. And his teenage daughter, God bless her, with tears in her eyes, she said, when I saw my dad jump over that rail, it was the scariest moment of my life. Jesus says that we should be willing to love each other even to the point of death. I think that in that moment right there, that fella had a very clear sense of what Jesus meant. So I want to talk with you about these three things that Jesus calls us to: love for God, love for each other, and love for the world. Love God, love each other, love the world. And ask you this: if that's what we're called to do, how do we incubate God's love? How do we grow in love for God? And how do we grow in our understanding and appreciation of God's love for us? I want to suggest to you that we can do that in lots of ways, but the best, most productive way to do that is in worship. When we gather together for worship, either virtually as you and I are doing right now, or when we are gathered together in a place of worship in a sanctuary, our goal is to create fertile soil, warm, fertile soil in folks' lives, so that when the seeds of faith that God plants fall into their lives, that faith can grow. And our goal in worship is to create the space for that to happen. That's one of the main ways we can incubate love for God in worship. So how do we incubate love for each other? If the first one of the three is love for God, the second one of the three is love for each other, how do we do that? I want to suggest to you that it's done through intentional connection, that we need to create an environment in which no person who is part of our body perceives that they are an outsider. My very first day in seminary, the morning was full of standing in line and filling out papers and a little of this and a little of that, and then we went for lunch in the dining hall at the seminary, and I was there alone. I didn't really know anybody who was there, and so when I walked into the cafeteria with my tray, I looked for an empty table and I sat down by myself. I didn't want to impose on anybody, and I was only sitting there for 30 seconds until some other person came up to me and they said, "Come sit with us. Nobody sits alone in this dining room." I was made immediately to feel like I was welcome there, that I was not an outsider, and it was important for me. This has been a very hard year for us to do that because of the pandemic. I just want to say that I think that the folks in the congregations of the Faith and Ferndale churches have done a pretty good job of staying connected, even though it's been a hard year to make that happen. How do we learn to love each other or grow to love each other? Through intentional connection. Number 3 is to love the world. Jesus said, love God, love each other, love the world. How do we carry that love of God into the world? Well, we reach out in service. And as we have seen in Jesus' own words, when he says service, he means sacrificial service, not just the easy things, but things that are sometimes very difficult for us. We are called to give as expressions of love for the world, to be willing to serve sacrificially. So if we take those three loves that Jesus gave to us, love God, love each other, love the world, and express them in practice, I would suggest to you these three words: worship, connect, and serve. We learn to grow in love with God through worship. We learn to love each other through connection. We learn to love the world through service. And I want to talk with you about the second one of those, connecting, today just a little bit. Last week, you may recall that we shared some conversation about how we can worship in ways that are fruitful and create warm, fertile soil for faith to grow. We talked about understanding what our role in worship is to be, how we're not really supposed to be the audience, that we're supposed to be the actors. And we talked about how when we gather for worship, it's a celebration of the gift we've gotten from Jesus Christ and a celebration of the chance we have to be with each other, and that it's also a time for us to surrender ourselves up to God so that God can cut away the dead wood that separates us from God and separates us from each other and separates us from serving the world. Today I want to talk with a little more detail about connecting with each other. And when I say connecting, I do not mean just learning other people's names so that we can say hello for the 5 seconds we see each other on the way into church and the 5 seconds we see each other on the way out. Although the truth is that some of us don't even do that, learn other people's names when we come into worship. I want to suggest to you that connection is really knowing, it's really building loving, self-sacrificing connections. Really building loving, self-sacrificing connection. Because when we do that, when we really come to know each other, when we really seek to build a loving, self-sacrificing connection with somebody, that yields loving community. And when we have a loving community, that fosters healthy communication. You know, we had a bishop once that used to say, look, we're going to have a meeting about this, and I want the meeting to deal with all the issues that are before us. I do not want half of the meeting to take place in the parking lot after this meeting is over. And you know, that happens a lot, doesn't it? We'll get together and we'll talk something over, and people will have opinions about a thing, but they didn't express them in the meeting. They express them to each other in the parking lot. And usually they are dissenting opinions that they didn't want to speak for some reason. But if we have a loving, self-sacrificing connection with each other that yields a loving community, it will foster healthy communication so that we're able to speak the truth to each other in love. There are some of us that are awfully good at speaking the truth, and some of us that are awful good at loving, but not both. Some folks speak the truth, but they don't do it with very much love. Some people love very well, but they don't always speak the truth. If we're a healthy community that has healthy communication, we should be able to do both. And I want to note with you that being a loving community that has healthy communication also has a lot of forgiveness in it. We've got to be willing to let things go. So if that's what we have, and that comes from being intentional about knowing and loving and being in connection with each other, then we will have a cooperative spirit. And that cooperative spirit always sparks creativity and enthusiasm. So we don't end up being a group that's always constantly saying, oh, woe is us, this will never work out. But instead we find ourselves speaking words of encouragement and affirmation into each other's lives and learning together how we can do things the best possible way. And so when we have that love connection with God and with each other and with the world, every victory achieved by one of us is a victory for the group. And every happy event is cause for all of us to celebrate. And every loss and every sorrow in the life of any one of us is a sorrow that is mourned by us all. And every struggle one of us goes through is a struggle in which we all share. I want to say again that I believe on the Faith and Ferndale charge, you're already doing a pretty good job of this. And you should feel good about yourselves if you're part of these congregations. But there are always ways that we can improve. And so I would say that if we want to work on our capacity to connect and live out this vision that I'm sort of describing here, we might begin by asking this question. How can we invite new people, different people, more people into this connection? And if we're going to do that, if we're going to start to ask ourselves that question, we need to pay attention to the current culture and ask ourselves, what can we do differently? What can we do better to connect with the current culture? And that may mean avoiding the tendency to keep doing the same things over and over again. You know, organizations have life cycles. They kind of a bell curve. They rise and then they decline. And not only do organizations have that, churches have that. And church Sunday school and little organizations inside the church, groups, Sunday school classes, and other parts of the life of church have kind of a life cycle. So they'll rise to a peak and then start to decline. Events have that. Events that are held in the church, they rise to a peak and then they begin to start to lose their usefulness and decline. We need to avoid the tendency to keep on doing things that are no longer serving our purpose of building connection. And instead, we need to use the creativity that our cooperative spirit will give us to imagine and embrace new and exciting ways to connect. And I think we can do that, can't we? Now listen, there's just one thing I want to say to you, because in case you're thinking I have told you that somehow the truth of Jesus has changed, that is not so. The truth of the Christ and the gospel message do not change, but cultures do change. And so the question is, how can we carry that truth into this culture here and now? How do we connect now? So what is our goal here? Well, our goal is to live this vision that we're talking about into this community, into our communities. We seek to love God. We seek to love each other. We seek to love the world. And we seek to live it in a way that the current culture can understand. And let me just say that churches, friends, Christians, it's possible for Christians to talk a thing to death. And that doing beats talking every time. And so I invite you today to ask yourself, well, what are we doing? Are we with humble, loving spirits, worshiping, connecting, and serving? May the Lord make it so in our lives this day. Amen.